There's a lot of talk that if we really want to advance sustainable food systems, we've got to share the responsibility very broadly. Governments have a role to play, business has a role to play, and increasingly we're hearing that consumers must act responsibly. So the part of the research that I have led has been looking at, as Sharon noted, the acceptability part of the food security equation. So what we'd like to think about is the 4 A's of food security. So I was looking at that last one. And our research aim was really to try and understand the extent to which, if the healthy and sustainable foods that Sharon described were available, affordable and accessible, are they also acceptable? Are they desired? Would people actually buy them and eat them? So, if not, what does that say about consumers and their capacity to take responsibility for sustainable food systems? Very briefly, we did the research in the same area that Sharon and Martin have described, and we had 2 major questions. How important to people was local, sustainable and healthy food, and what were the major barriers to buying those foods? We used a nested qualitative research. It was small scale. We used the same areas that Sharon used, and we only interviewed 8 households in each of 3 areas, the most disadvantaged, the middle advantaged and the most advantaged area. We chose those areas within 20 minutes walk of the shops. We requested that up to 2 households provide a photo essay of the meals to actually get at who was sitting at the table and the practices around the food. And we did an accompanied shopping trip with one of those households to further probe what the rationale was for buying that food over that food. We ran a focus group in each of the 3 areas, again, to get richer data. Now, we could have easily done a survey and asked people, do you buy these foods, local foods, sustainable foods, healthy foods? How do you rate them? We could have done Likert scales. But I was most interested in the way food sits within the everyday practices of household living, and within the cost structures and those other upstream determinants of life that Sharon depicted in one of her figures. We weren't going to get that if we just asked people to rank yes, no, important, not so important. Very briefly, we did do, in this accompanied shopping trip, we did look at the local food environments to see how attractive, how accessible those shops were to participants. Interestingly, we found that the most affluent area, the residents had access to an appalling little shopping centre, whereas in the poorest area they had ready access to a pretty brand new complex of good shops and a very good food retail mix. And St Clair in the middle had a modest array of good quality shops. Car dependence or car use was required really in all of those settings except for St Clair, and certainly in the most affluent area they spent most of their time driving to shops quite some distance away. Now, broadly, we did not find differences across that social gradient of neighbourhoods. This is probably not unexpected, given that each of those areas contains marked variations in household socio-demographics and socioeconomic status. Also, we did have such a small sample. There was one area in which we did find a difference, and that was around an aspiration to care for the environment. So in Quakers Hill, the more affluent area, we heard, yes, we would buy food on the basis of their environmental credentials more if we didn't have children to feed, if we had more time, when we're retired, we will do it. We did not hear that sentiment in the other two areas, but we certainly heard life stage differences in emphasis, particularly for families with children, and people arguing that, yes, of course, I would be able to do it, but with the kids it's very difficult. I used to do the right thing, but now that's not possible. Our second broad finding, or third broad finding, was that the purchase of healthy food is a discretionary purchase because they're seen as more expensive and they may be wasted. Healthy foods, and I'll come to describe what they are to these respondents, they may be wasted if the taste is not appealing, again, particularly if children are present. And across the three areas, there was a marked discordance, a resentment even, that people weren't practicing what they would like to practice. They were keen to eat more healthily, to live more sustainably, but they felt that there were a range of barriers to doing that. So the next few slides, I'm just going to address sustainable consumption, local food and healthy food separately. Sustainable food purchasing and use was not a priority in any of the households. And this top quote was pretty representative. Well, I'm not going to lie, I do recycle, but I can't really say I buy this packet of cornflakes because of some environmental factor. We heard that across the board. We actually had to prompt for sustainability answers to that question. But we did hear a lot in the course of the visits and the shopping about the importance of recycling and care with the use of plastic bags. And it was almost like throwaway lines. And now we think that actually those two practices are becoming normalised and people don't reflect that they're sustainable practices. But in general, we heard that sustainable consumption was a niche practice that does not fit into lives where cost of living is a major concern. So this quote here, my parents will do it. But they can afford it. I'm buying for 4 people, and if you try and buy all organic and the right products, it's not sustainable. Basically, you can't do it. But equally, we must appreciate that in Australia, we've had 70 years of being taught that the right way of shopping is to do it thriftily. A thrifty shopper in this country is an admired shopper. We should all aspire to being thrifty. And we've had that told to us by governments, home economists, advertisers, the supermarkets for 70 to 80 years. People were very concerned about food waste, however, and it was less an environmental concern than a financial concern. So, yet again, one way to counter food being wasted was to buy tasty food. Taste followed price in importance. Both are related to the household budget. Acceptable taste often precluded healthy food items because acceptable tastes were foods that appealed once again to children and, dare I say it, often to men. who liked the sweet treat or the salty snacks. Local food. How this was described, it was not from the region. It was not food from Greater Western Sydney. Local food was Australian food. But we heard, forget local food, that is desirable, but food has to be affordable. And then the issue of trust arose. And why would you privilege local food if you don't really know whether the farmer's market food is local or not? What people were overwhelmingly concerned about was Australian farmers, their future prosperity and the unfairness of cheap imported food. This was the point in the interview where we got the most emotion, where we got people really taking off in their desire to discuss how resentful they felt about what was happening to Australian farmers. But then again, they would say, cheap food is also important. Their way around it is we shouldn't be exporting our meat, for example. We should be flooding the market and bringing the price down. Even in the most affluent area, food price trumped other qualities. One mother said about her son and daughter, they've got bells and whistles lifestyles, you know. They've got big houses, all mod cons and numerous cars. They've got busy lives. Food is a very lower order of priority. And as one social epidemiologist, Len Simers, pointed out, this makes sense. People have lives to lead. What is healthy food? Well, these people do not need more nutrition education. They all answered, healthy food is fresh food. It's any food that has not been processed. It's fresh food and it's Australian food. They often equated healthy food with Australian food because they felt we had higher food standards. But, they said, fresh food is getting more expensive, and they were generally disappointed with what was in the supermarkets. And then they noted that independent butchers and greengrocers had fresher food, better food, but that was time consuming and may cost more money. I'll just point out, because I am running out of time, that we did hear, not in answer to healthy food, local food or sustainable food, a lot about backyard gardening. And it seemed to us a half of our households were doing some form of backyard gardening. Not for any of those reasons, but for price reasons and that it was fun. So, coming to our conclusion, we're very mindful that an awful lot of there are bad news stories every week about people in Western Sydney. They're criminals, they're vandals, they're poverty-stricken, they don't do the right thing by their children. We were very, very aware that we did not want our research, which said that in fact healthy, sustainable, local foods aren't the top of the priority list, to play out in that way. And when we reread the transcripts, what we saw was an extraordinary level of moral behaviour taking place. These people were consuming in a thrifty way, in a convenient way. They did appreciate novel food consumptions. And as Kim Humphrey, who wrote a book in 2010 called Excess, commented, if you don't consume those sorts of qualities or in those sorts of ways, either you're signalling an act of rebellion, dropping out of society, or a signal of personal failure due in the main to poverty. How our households were thinking and responding to food was in terms of the Australian ethos, living a decent standard of living. And they were particularly putting a lot of credence on a duty of care around family. And family eating was observed that went beyond food and nutrition. It was there to provide pleasure, preserve family harmony, and nutritainment. Our photos show a lot of images of mothers with children cooking, but making it a fun activity. So we social scientists and food scientists have to reflect that food consumption is but one social practice in a long list of practices: housing practices, employment practices, transport practices, parenting practices. We have to understand the rhythmic richness and modulation of everyday life. So my final slide. And Sharon put up two of these points. What we need to debate is the two top points are around intervening on the economics of the food system. Do we need market intervention on food price relativities, either by way of GST or import tariffs, in order to bring the relative cost of fresh foods down to the cost of processed foods, or the other way around, processed foods to increase their cost and bring it up to the level of fresh foods, given the plight of Australian farmers? I mean, there is a cheap food paradox going on here. Consumers might benefit from cheap food, but Australian producers don't. Or we could actually act on the social policy side of the equation. Food policy is as much a matter of social policy as it is of food policy, food system policy. And certainly what we heard here and in other research that I've done in rural Australia is actually consumers are crying out for government leadership. They don't want governments not to intervene in a variety of ways, and governments could be much more proactive in the sorts of ways that both Martin and Sharon have pointed out, and something that hasn't been mentioned but is happening in other major world cities, where local governments are major procurers of local food for institutions. So, you know, if we started to feed our prisoners well and our hospital patients well, we started to normalise and legitimise healthy and sustainable diets, then I think the rest of the population would follow. Thank you.